Okay, welcome to Grand Avenue Baptist Church. Welcome to Foundations. My name is Dean VanEvery. I'm recording this after already finishing the whole Old Testament project. I'm recording this here in December. I'm going back and re-recording, or I guess recording for the first time, some of the earlier lessons from our Old Testament series. So I just finished up working through the entire Old Testament in our foundations class, our adult Sunday school class that follows the Sunday service. So we didn't record the first four lessons. I'm eventually going to go back and record each of those. So this is the same notes, same content. I'm not like redoing all the research that I did for it. So I'm just going to be working back through the lessons that we went through back at the beginning of the year, back in this past, I think February it must have been. This is not the original lesson, but we're going to be working through the content just to kind of get all the content up there online. We're gonna start with Genesis. Start with Genesis today. We'll do Genesis today, or in this lesson, and then Exodus will be another one, and then we'll do Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those three will be one, and then Joshua and Judges will be one lesson, and then that should catch us up back to the recordings that are already on the podcast. I'm excited to get to kind of go back and just rethink about some of these, because again, I'm not doing fresh research on these things, but I am, bringing the rest of the research that I've done since this time, right? So I did the work on this one on Genesis about a year ago, and then covered the rest of the Old Testament. And so now, nothing really crazy that I wasn't aware of that got brought to light, but there are certainly things that got deepened, certainly understandings of mine that were sharpened and tweaked and reinforced in some ways. And so, just excited to kind of have another swing at these books. Anyways, so these earlier lessons were a little bit more tightly structured, kind of around four basic, I don't even know what to call them, just themes that I would hit on each lesson. So the first one was always just the book structure. How is this book divided? That carried through the rest of the lessons all the way through the Old Testament. But then in these early ones, I would break out three specific themes that I wanted to look at, what each book said about them. What does this book say about God? What does this book say about redemption? Kind of who is Jesus? What is the gospel? Those kinds of things. And then what were some application points from this book? Towards the end, especially in the second semester, once we got out of the narrative books, those kind of converged more or less into basically just the question of what are some of the major themes. Really, that was meant, that move to more just kind of a major themes idea, was meant to just let me be a little bit more sensitive to just what each book kind of wants to say for itself, as far as what things it emphasizes, what things it doesn't emphasize. So that just opened up a little bit more flexibility for me. But whether we were doing God, redemption, application, or just kind of hitting major themes, we still were basically seeing some of the same elements. That was kind of the major ideas that the Old Testament just keeps pushing in front of us. Is just it has a lot to say about God, about man, about man's history, his destiny, what God is doing in the world, about who Jesus is, the Redeemer He's going to send into the world, and what He's going to accomplish when He is sent into the world. And it's very applicable, right? It's everywhere throughout the Old Testament has a lot to say about what it looks like to fear the Lord, what it looks like to live rightly before your Maker, before your Redeemer. Anyways, just with that kind of high level overview, that's what this whole project is, of this Old Testament survey, this Old Testament overview. We're looking at, yeah, what does this book, the Old Testament, and this collection of books, the books of the Old Testament, well, what does this say about God? What does this say about man, his history, his destiny? What does this say about Christ and the plan of redemption, the purposes of redemption? What does this say about how we should live today and tomorrow and the rest of our lives? So that's what we see in each of these books, each of these lessons. So today I'll just jump into Genesis and we'll get started from there. So Genesis, it's the first book in the Bible, and that word Genesis, the title of it, just comes from the Greek word for beginning, right? So it's just the beginning, right? It's named after the first word in the book, which it says in the beginning, right? So Genesis, it's important. It's the first book. It starts the story. It lays the foundations, and that's a lot of the themes that we're going to trace through the entire Old Testament. They find their origin here in Genesis. They find their foundations here in Genesis. At the just recently, but in the last lesson, finishing up the book of the 12, I gave the illustration of that the Old Testament kind of builds its themes, builds its composition, something like a fugue, where there's kind of a simple theme that starts the composition, and then you add another theme, another simple theme, another simple theme, another simple theme, until as you're adding these simple themes together, you build this complex, masterpiece of a composition. And so where the Minor Prophets is kind of at the height of the complexity, the height of the climax of it all, Genesis is the fairly simple beginnings. Genesis is the humble, lowly, simple, almost just very straightforward beginnings of these themes that we're going to tease out in the rest of the Old Testament. So this is where you start. This is where you set the trajectories. And even this is there are four books in the Old Testament that are or I guess the four most common books that are quoted in the New Testament. Genesis is one of them. Of the top four books in the Old Testament that the New Testament authors quote, Genesis is one of them. I believe the others are Deuteronomy, Isaiah, and the Psalms. So Genesis, Deuteronomy, Isaiah, and the Psalms, kind of your I don't know, tent pegs of books in the Old Testament. So Genesis lays the foundations. Genesis sets the trajectories, says this is the story we're telling, this is where we're going to be going. So a quick note on, or maybe not so quick, but just a note on the structure of Genesis. There's kind of four major chunks in the book of Genesis, all roughly 11 to 13 chapters long. So there's 50 chapters total, and so each of these major chunks is a little bit over 10 chapters. So the first one is basically global history. The first 11 chapters, chapter 1 through 11, this covers a couple thousand years and details the beginnings, not just of the line of Israel, not just of the human race, but of creation itself. Really, there's lots of ways you can look at it. But honestly, there's just no there's just no way to look at this and not see this as some kind of a fairly straightforward historical account. This is God telling us what actually happened at the very beginnings of the human race. Where did we come from? What's the very beginnings of our history? There's just no good reason to read this as anything other than just ancient history, straight up. So these first 11 chapters, chapter 1, you get the creation account. Chapters 2 through 3, you get what's called the account of the fall, where man fell into sin. Chapters 6 through 9, skipping a little bit there, but chapters 6 through 9, that's where you're going to get Noah's flood, right? That's where you're going to get the story of Noah and his ark. That's where you're going to get the story of, just that period in world history. And then chapter 11 is the Tower of Babel. And that has some historic, or that has significant implications for the structure of the rest of the Bible, because basically what the story of the Bible is doing is showing how God is reconciling all peoples to himself, and is calling all peoples to himself, to have one Lord and one God and one King and one Master under him, under the Lord Jesus Christ. And at Babel, that's kind of really where that first where that really gets dispersed, because that's the account of where we get the origin of different languages. Where before this story, and you can go read it for yourself in chapter 11 there, before this event, all mankind spoke one common language. But after this, they were scattered. And this, leads to all the chaos and conflict and bloodshed just from that kind of misunderstanding. So this is basically the kind of final ripping apart of human history, that then the rest of the scripture details how the Lord stitches this back together, not just by putting band-aids on it, but by renewing us. Paul talks about this as being, in place of two, Jews and Gentiles, God is making one new man by tearing down the dividing wall of hostility that was erected between them. So this is Babel, or again, this is the foundation. This is the trajectory. This is where the story of the scriptures starts. So that's just hugely foundational. This is obviously the story of Adam and Eve comes from here. So this is the foundation, the bedrock, the beginning. These first 11 chapters, kind of the global history, really cosmic history of basically laying out what our problem is. Right. This is again where we get the whole idea of sin, the whole problem of what God is trying to solve, or what God is solving in and through Jesus Christ. So that's kind of your first major chunk in Genesis, chapters 1 through 11. And then 12 through 50, chapters 12 through chapter 50, it slows down a lot to just zoom in on basically four generations of the family of Abraham. So Abraham, he's a hugely significant figure in human history and world history in the scriptures here. So we meet Abraham in chapter 12, and basically chapter 12 through 23, it's about 11 chapters again. Chapter 12 through 23 covers the story of Abraham. Um, and then chapters 24 through 26 talks about Isaac, kind of gives the story of Isaac, who's Abraham's son. There's some reason why that might be so much shorter, but he doesn't seem to really get a spotlight shown on him. He almost kind of seems to be almost an interlude between major characters. He gets about 3 chapters, and then Jacob gets 10 chapters, right? So I think he kind of fills out this second section. So the second section seems, or so third, or sorry, the first section is global history. Second section is Abraham, chapters 12 through 23. And then the second section, or third section, sorry, the third section seems to be chapter 24 through 36. It's basically Isaac and Jacob, with 10 of those 13 chapters being Jacob, right? So Jacob kind of being the major character of that section. And then the fourth and final section is 37 through 50, which is again 14 chapters. And that's all about the story of Joseph, one of Jacob's sons. So Abraham, his son Isaac, his son Jacob, and then one of his 12 sons is Joseph. And so Joseph is kind of the main character of the last 14 chapters of Genesis. So the way that I see that, really, so there's basically 3 sections, and each of those 3 men and their stories seems to emphasize something about what God is trying to teach us about the unfolding story of human history and even of redemptive history. So Abraham is often called the man of faith, or something to that effect. And so in Abraham, you see both a picture of what it looks like to believe God, to trust God, and especially to patiently wait on God's promises. And so in the story of Abraham, the main thing that God is showing us is his faithfulness, that he makes these promises. And even though it takes a long time, even though it feels to us like it's taking way too long, God is faithful, that he is not slow in fulfilling his promises. So then I think that the couple of chapters on Isaac, they're important because basically they show that this Isaac is the fulfillment of this promise. But then he gets into Jacob, and Jacob, he's an interesting character because he's not a righteous man. He's not held up as a, hey, this is a really good example of what it means to be a good God fearing man. He tricks his dad. He deceives and tricks his brother. He runs away from home and deceives and tricks his uncle. Right? He's not held up as a paragon of virtue. And yet, I think he's zeroed in on, and his story is emphasized in such a way to help us to, right from the beginning, get the picture that God is in the business of pursuing and working through justified sinners. Justified sinners. That Jacob isn't held up as, this is what it looks like to be a good, noble, godly man. Though he certainly becomes that. He certainly becomes that. He's primarily, it seems to be primarily held up as, this is what it looks like to be a sinner who is redeemed, who is justified. So we see God's faithfulness with Abraham, and we see God's grace, God's justifying grace with Jacob. And then with Joseph, he's very famously has a hard go of it. So he is basically sold into slavery by his brothers when he's young, and then is falsely accused of a horrible crime and is thrown in jail for several years. But then the Lord uses him to interpret some dreams, and he's exalted to the right hand of the Pharaoh in Egypt, and God uses him to save not just Egypt, but even the whole line of his family, the promised, the line that the promised deliverer is going to come from. He uses Joseph to save them, right? So it's this huge turnaround from tragedy after tragedy after tragedy to finally God exalts him. God pulls him out of prison and puts him at the right hand of the throne of Pharaoh. So there's, Christological, there's Jesus echoes in there. But really, even just at a simple level, we see there the sufferer who is redeemed. The sufferer who is redeemed. Right? We saw Abraham, the man of faith, Jacob, the sinner justified, and then in Joseph we see the sufferer who is redeemed. And kind of paralleling with that, with Abraham, the man of faith, we see God's faithfulness. With Jacob, the sinner justified, we see God's grace, and with Joseph, the sufferer redeemed, we see God's sovereignty. We see God's sovereignty. So in these 4 generations, especially these 3 kind of major characters in this book of Genesis, what this book is trying to set up for us as we kind of launch into the Old Testament is that we should see kind of God's covenant promises, right? Didn't really touch on that. Didn't really touch on that so much, but his covenant promises when we fall into sin, when we eat the fruit, fall into sin, God curses the serpent, says that a man is going to come, Eve, from you. Who's going to crush this serpent, right? So these covenant promises of redemption of the human race, this starts to get narrowed down into the line of Abraham, the line of Jacob, into the family of Joseph. Um, so that these covenant promises are going to be fulfilled by a God who's faithful, even though it seems like it's taken a long time, just like the promise to Abraham, that God is going to be faithful to fulfill his promises. Second, that God isn't going to work with only perfect people, but he's actually going to be in the business of justifying sinners. That this is a God of grace who justifies, who uses broken, sinful people to redeem them, restore them, teach them to walk uprightly, and to use them in his purposes. And then lastly, this God is sovereign. That even when Joseph gets thrown in the pit, he's still perfectly fulfilling God's good plan for him. So God is faithful, God is gracious, and God is sovereign. This is the message of who God is coming out of the book of Genesis. Okay, so that's kind of the structural component. That's the four major sections of the book of Genesis. Next, I'll move into kind of just some theological reflection on the book of Genesis. Basically, I have 4 points for you of what we should learn about God from the book of Genesis. First is God in creation. Second is God in history. Third is just the simple fact that God initiates, and fourth is that God works through covenants. So, first, God and creation. Really, we see this throughout the book, but especially just in chapter one. In chapter one, the account of the 7 days of creation, or the 6 days of creation, and the day of rest. So it's really what we see there, and especially as you start to kind of be aware of kind of some pagan creation myths. You start to kind of see some of the contrasts. So one big contrast that needs to be mentioned is just the singular will that you see at work in God creating the universe. That there is no kind of dueling of wills. There's no, God wanted this, but creation kind of wouldn't let him, or this other spiritual force wouldn't let him. In the creation account, it's just God willed, God said, it was. No contests, no conflicts, no struggle, no effort. There was just will and reality. The second thing that you notice about God and creation in that chapter is just that God is not a God kind of interwoven and interrelated with creation. Meaning it's not God kind of working within the system trying to get it to conform to his will. It's God kind of in a one directional relationship telling creation exactly what it's going to be. God conditions. God creates, conditions, modifies, directs, lords over, is master over creation, shapes creation, and creation in no way shapes or conditions God. There's a one-way relationship here between God and creation. So second, God and history. Again, the Genesis sets up for you the fact that the Bible is not a national drama. It is a global story, bringing in all nations and all people. So the story begins with all nations. It begins with Adam and Eve, not the father of the Israelites, but the father of all nations, the father of all men. So the story begins with all nations. All nations are judged in the flood, right? This isn't a local thing. This is a global, universal. All nations are judged in the flood. All nations are scattered at Babel. All nations are involved in the curse and the destructive effects of that. And ultimately, through the promises to Abraham and his offspring, all nations will be blessed through Abram's seed. Genesis 22, God explicitly says, all nations will be blessed through your seed. So God is not just kind of working to redeem a people or one people. He's working to redeem all peoples. God is sovereignly working out his plan for all of mankind through all of history. So God in creation, God in history. Third, God initiates. Right, Genesis paints a picture of a very high initiative God. God is never reacting. God is never responding to what we're doing. Creation, again, is purposeful. It's meaningful. It's a free act. It's not one day God felt like he had to. It's God decided. God did. God acted. God initiated. Redemption, God initiates. God comes to Abraham. Abraham at that time, he's called Abram. Abraham didn't kind of earn God's attention. He didn't get God to notice him. God just showed up to Abraham and said, "This is what you're going to do, and this is what I'm going to do through you." So God initiates. Then fourth, covenants. This is kind of an interesting thing that you need to start to notice. This is going to be really important throughout the rest of the Old Testament. Basically, just the idea is this: God always interacts with his human creatures through covenants. God's relationship to each and every human being is a covenantal relationship. God always relates to people as covenant people. So this is with Adam. He has a certain covenant relation to him, basically saying, "Don't eat that fruit, or you'll receive these certain covenant curses." covenant penalties. He relates to Noah through a covenant. Relates to Abraham through a covenant. He relates to Isaac and Jacob and the rest of his sons through a covenant. So this isn't the kind of Enlightenment picture of this isolated individual that God is relating with, but there's a certain kind of a legal and covenantal idea to what it means to relate to God. So what is a covenant? A covenant, really, it's basically just this legal interpersonal relationship created through some kind of a binding agreement. Right, so there it kind of implies this legal dimension to just to human nature. Honestly, to human nature. So Jean Rousseau was a French philosopher who did really just a ton of damage to human society through a lot of his ideas, ton of his ideas. But one of them was basically this idea of man, this kind of thought experiment of man in his state of nature, man kind of before or outside of any kind of society, any kind of social constructs, any kind of legal relationships. As man, you think of man in the jungle. And he wasn't really trying to do like a historical reconstruction. It was more of a thought experiment of kind of what is true of man, abstracted away from all these things that we see in society. But the biblical picture would be, if you abstract man outside of legal covenantal society, you've abstracted man out of his natural habitat. Out of his natural habitat. Man, according to the scriptures, is naturally covenantal, is naturally in some kind of a legal covenant relationship, not just with God, especially with God, but with God but also with each other. You see this in marriage, that immediately when God brings Eve to Adam, there's a marriage covenant pronounced. There's marriage covenant language going on. So man, in all of his most personal, most intimate, most real relationships, is covenantal. He's covenantal. So God relates to man in and through covenant because he created us to be covenant creatures. So this is both our problem, right? Our covenant relationship to Adam is kind of the big source of our problem. This is where we inherit the fall from. But it's also the source of solution. It's through covenant relation to the promised seed of Abraham, to the promised serpent crusher. It's through covenant relation to Jesus Christ that we can be justified before God because of his righteousness and his suffering and death. So covenant is the most natural relationship that we have as humans towards God, but also towards one another. Okay, so that's God. So then second, what do we learn? I guess third, structure, God, and then redemption. What does Genesis teach us about redemption? So one of the big features that you see in Genesis is a lot of genealogies, a lot of kind of just lists of so and so was the son of so and so was had this son, and then he had this son, and then he had this son, right? So it's this. It seems like it's just a lot of kind of information about family history, but really what's happening there is that it's tracing out this genealogical covenantal promise, right? If there's this promise to Eve, one of your sons is going to crush this serpent. And so you kind of need to trace that sonship. You need to trace that lineage. And then it gets to Abraham. One of your seeds, one of your offspring is going to be the blessing to all nations. So you get this transgenerational story being told that wants to trace out not just this interesting family's history, but trace out the story of redemption through this family. So a big part of what's going on in that is kind of just pressing us towards this call to patience, pressing us towards this promise that was given to Eve is going to take a long time to be fulfilled. It's going to take a long time to be fulfilled. So you need to be patient. You need to wait. This is why, and again, back to Abraham, he's held up as this example of someone who faithfully, someone who faithfully waited years, decades for the fulfillment of God's promise. So what Genesis is trying to help us to see is that this redemptive promise, this promise of a redeemer through the line of the woman, it's going to take patience. It's going to require some waiting. But then a couple of kind of specific points to note, just as far as the redemptive history that gets set up in the book of Genesis, really is a couple of promises. One at the very beginning of the book, and the other at the very end of the book. So the first, I've mentioned it already, is Genesis 3:15. So I don't think I've actually told the story, told the actual story so far. But so God creates the universe, creates the world, creates mankind in the space of 6 days, and then comes to Adam and basically says, "Don't eat of this tree. If you eat of this tree, you're going to die." Then one day the serpent comes and deceives Eve. Eve takes the fruit from that forbidden tree, takes a bite of it, hands it to her husband. Adam eats. Then God comes to them, and he comes to confront them and say, you did the thing that you were told not to do, the one thing, the one tree that I told you not to eat from. You ate from. Why did you do that? And so in that process, he pronounces curses. He pronounces a curse to Adam, pronounces a curse to Eve. But then within the curse to the serpent, which is interesting, within the curse to the serpent, um, he unfolds this promise. There's kind of this promise wrapped in this curse, where he says to you, serpent, I'm gonna create enmity. I'm gonna create animosity, opposition between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. And one day, one of her offspring is going to crush your head, and you will bruise his heel. So he gets this picture, this picture set up of this curse came into the world through this serpent, and yet this serpent is going to be crushed. It's again, think of the fugue, a very simple idea. The snake is bad. Someday someone's going to come and take care of this snake. It doesn't really spell out exactly what all that means, but as it gets fleshed out, we see that this is a promise of undoing the curse. This gets a little bit fleshed out with Abraham, when Abraham gets promised that through him there's going to be global blessing, right? Blessing and curses, those are opposites, and so there's this global curse came in through the serpent, but through the line of Abraham, there's going to be global blessing, right? That is going to undo this blessing. So you start to see this kind of woven in kind of opposition and solution to, or I guess in fulfillment of Genesis 3:15, that promise of the curse, or that curse. But the second verse I want to draw your attention to is just Genesis 49, verse 10. And this is so. This is an interesting prophecy, basically of a coming king from the line of Judah. Judah being one of Jacob's sons, one of Israel's sons. So this verse comes from in the middle of a story or a time where Jacob is blessing each of his 12 sons, and he gets to Judah, and he says this in verse 10: "The scepter." Which is a picture of royal rule, of kingly authority. "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples." So again, you just get this prophecy that there's going to be a king in the house of Judah. Again, you don't get much done with that. It's a simple theme at this point, but there's just this prophecy of a coming king. Interestingly, we'll see that this promise and the promise to Abraham, a blessing to all nations, that his offspring will be as numerous as the sand of the sea and as many as the stars of the heavens. That promise, the verbiage of that promise, and the verbiage of the promise I just read about the scepter gets kind of merged together in the book of Numbers, which starts to bring together these two promises: the Abrahamic promise of blessing through the offspring of Abraham, and the kingly promise. Eventually, this gets fleshed out more through David, when God promises to build a house for David. That there be always be a son from the line of David to rule over the people of God. So this is where these promises start, right? They get again fleshed out, they get expanded, they get kind of teased out. But even in the book of Genesis, we just start to get these little nuggets, these little foundation stones that get laid out for us. Okay, so that's structure, theology, redemption. Now I want to make a few kind of just pastoral comments on application. How do we? What are kind of the applicational thrusts of the book of Genesis? So the first one that comes to mind is just the idea of worship and gratitude. This idea of worship and gratitude. As you read Genesis 1, one of the thoughts that should be coming to your mind is, wow, all of this is a gift. All of this is a gift. Creation doesn't deserve to be created. I never earned the right to be born. All that I am, all that I have, all that I've ever experienced is a gift from the gracious hand of God. So that should give me awe and wonder, and cause me to worship this God who's so powerful and so mighty and so glorious to be able to do all this. But then also gratitude to the God who's so gracious and kind that He would willingly do this for me, that He would give this to me. So Genesis, I mean, even just that again, first chapter should fill us with worship and gratitude. Second application is all the story, especially as you think about Abraham, or really especially as you think about Joseph, should give you trust in the middle of chaos. Should give you trust and hope and confidence in the middle of chaos. Again, whether it's you're talking about global chaos, whether you're talking about like big, where is God taking this history? What is God doing in the world? Is God really in control? Does God really have a plan for history, or even just like personal, your own personal history? Man, I just lost my job, or just had some bad thing just happened, or some personal tragedy, or even just kind of ongoing malaise, and just the chaos of your own life. The book of Genesis should remind you that God is able to work through even the darkest of situations, even the darkest and most hopeless of situations. God is still working, and is still working out his covenant promises to do just exactly what he said he would do. Again, a third kind of related to that is the idea that we need to be waiting in hope. Waiting in hope that God's covenant promises that what God has promised he will do often takes time and longer than we would like. Usually longer than we would like. And yet, God is still working. God is still at work to do the things that he promised to do. None of these stories were quick. Let's see. Fourth kind of application: God is in the business of redemption. God is in the business of taking broken people, saving them, redeeming them, reconciling them, drawing them to himself. So yeah, broken people. Think about Jacob, the trickster, the one who wrestled with God. God is in the business of redeeming broken people, and he's in the business of redeeming broken situations. Think of Joseph, right? He is a pretty upstanding guy himself, but just finds himself in some bad situations. God is in the business of redeeming broken situations. And last, kind of the thing that you should be thinking about throughout the book of Genesis is just kind of the lesson that we get from Genesis 3, from the curse, from when Adam and Eve get exiled from the garden. Because the final, kind of the finishing touch of the penalty of violating God's covenant, what happened to them is that Adam and Eve were driven out of the garden, the door was locked behind them, and a big tough angel with a flaming sword was put in their way to guard the door so they couldn't come back. They were kicked out of the presence of God. They were kicked out of paradise. They were kicked out of fellowship with the living and true God. And this is the big tragedy, right? It's not the unlimited fruit. It's not the, pleasant weather. Um, it's fellowship with God that was the great loss of the fall. It is right standing, right relationship with God. That's the great tragedy of the fall. So our great loss from the book of Genesis is that fellowship, is that relationship with God. But on the flip side of that, our great hope is not good circumstances. Our great hope is not wealth, it's not health, it's not security. Right? These can be very good things that God gives to his people. God has a lot to say about those things in his word, but the great hope of the Christian is that we would be reconciled to God, that we would be allowed back into the presence of God. And the rest of the Bible unfolds and shows us that it's only through Jesus Christ that we can do this. It's only through the serpent crusher, whose heel is bruised by the serpent. He suffers horribly to pay for our redemption. But in the end, our redemption comes from his blood and his perfect life. His life lived for us to fulfill the law of God that we couldn't fulfill, to fulfill the covenant requirements of God's law that we didn't fulfill, that we aren't fulfilling. He did that for us in his perfect active obedience, but he also suffered the penalty of our sin. He suffered for the fact that we failed, that I failed to uphold the law of God, that I failed to fulfill the covenant, God's covenant with man in creation. So he lived for us, he obeyed for us, and he died for us. He suffered for us and took our place. So this is what Genesis sets up for us, sets up some of these covenant themes, some of these just theological themes, redemptive themes, application themes. We'll tease out some of these in the lessons to come. For now, this has been the book of Genesis. Again, just kind of a flyover, just kind of a quick flyby of some of the major themes that you're going to find in the book of Genesis. We'll come back. The next lesson will be on Exodus, and we'll go from there. Again, I guess thanks for listening. I appreciate it. Hope this is encouraging. Hope this is somewhat enlightening for you and somewhat helpful for you. So thank you very much.